Welcome to Strange Dimensions. The interface to alternate realities. Contact experiences. And mysterious phenomena. And now your host for Strange Dimensions Radio. Here's Rosemary Ellen Guiley.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Strange Dimensions Radio. If you're in America, I hope you had a great holiday yesterday, relaxing, doing some fun things, and remembering the founding of this great country. Well, tonight's show is something that I have been looking forward to for quite some time. Keep your lights on tonight, folks, because we are going into the very depths of the dark and the demonic with the St. Louis demonic possession case that was the basis for the 1973 film The Exorcist and the novel that the film was based on by Peter Blatty. And with me tonight is one of my old and very dear friends, best-selling author Stephen LaChance. He has a new book out that has released some fresh insights and brand new evidence never before released to the public about the truth behind this case. And it goes very, very deep. So I know you're going to enjoy every minute of this show. And we're going to be playing some clips from The Exorcist as well. So do get into the chat room. You can see some photos from the film The Exorcist. And we'll be playing some of those creepy sounds from the final exorcism scene as we go along tonight. But first, a few announcements. You know, every time I think that reality TV, paranormal reality TV, has hit a new low, another one comes along. And now we have, by no coincidence, Rob Lowe and his sons getting a show with A&E to do documentaries on exploring and investigating the paranormal out in the field. And Rob says that while they were out filming an episode on Sasquatch, something approached their camp. He was out camping with his two sons, and he was absolutely terrified for his life and lay down on the ground, absolutely convinced that he might be killed by whatever it was that was approaching the camp. Well, I would like to know how Rob Lowe, who is not a paranormal investigator and hasn't done any of this kind of work before, goes out with a film crew and has an astonishing experience like that when researchers in the field can spend years out in the woods trying to document things, sounds, photographs, and never have anything quite that dramatic happen to them. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? So Rob has said in his pre-show publicity that he's fully aware that this story makes him sound like, quote, a crazy Hollywood kook, quote. Well, I guess we'll have to arrive at our own conclusion when the show actually airs. A couple of other announcements, moving on to happier topics. This coming weekend is my big banquet with the Psychic Spectrum in Seattle. I'm out in the sunny Pacific Northwest. Yes, it is sunny out here during the summer. This July, and the Psychic Spectrum has put together a beautiful gala banquet, and I'm the guest of honor this coming Saturday evening. If you're in the greater Seattle area, come on down to the Poodle Dog restaurant in Fife. That's where we're holding the banquet. I'll be giving away some books talking about the creative and psychic aspects of dreams for my banquet topic. And this coming fall, November 8th through the 13th, I'll be one of the featured speakers on a paranormal mysteries cruise in the Caribbean. Really looking forward to that. Early holiday break for you all if you want to come along. And if you sign up now and reserve your cabin, the first person who puts this promo code into the box, R. Guiley, that's my last name, Guiley, you will get a free set of 4 of my most popular books, The Jinn Connection, Demon Haunted, Haunted by the Things You Love, and my brand new one now, The Road to Strange, all autographed, of course. So go to mysteriescruise.com and in the promo box, put in R. Guiley to get your free set of books, along with a terrific cruise through the Caribbean. All right, getting on now to the topic for tonight. The dark and the demonic, the St. Louis possession case in 1949, where 60-some years into the history of this case here, it has been examined up one side and down the other by so many investigators and researchers. And yet, Stephen LaChance has spent a decade himself researching this case and has come up with new evidence. His new book is called Confrontation with Evil, an in-depth review of the 1949 possession that inspired The Exorcist. Now, the original case involved a young boy. In the film, it was changed into a girl named Reagan, but it did affect very deeply a young boy and his family. And this poor boy went through literally, you can say, literally hell. So we're going to be finding out about some of the shocking truths behind this case tonight. And let me tell you a little bit about Stephen LaChance. He's been called one of the most prolific supernatural writers of this generation, and I know for a fact he's a very popular figure in the paranormal field. In 2007, he released his best-selling nonfiction book, The Uninvited, which details the true story of his own horrific haunting, living in the infamous Screaming House in Union, Missouri. We'll have a chance to get into that tonight, too. The sequel, Blessed Are the Wicked, was released in 2014. Stephen is also the author of Fiction, a groundbreaking short story collection called Crazy, which was followed up last fall by the release of a full-length version of Truck Stop Hell. That title is called Crazy, A Prayer for the Dead. Stephen is a personality on numerous television and radio programs worldwide, documentaries, shows. He had starring roles in the Booth Brothers documentaries Children of the Grave and The Possessed, which is actually how I met up with him in person, and that was just about a decade ago. If you want to know more about Stephen's work, his investigations, and his events and activities, go to his website, StephenLaChance.com. And I want to remind you folks to drop on into the chat room and take a look at those photographs and have some questions ready for Stephen this evening as we get into this very intriguing topic. Stephen, I want to welcome you to the show. Thanks so much for joining me tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. Has it really been a decade, huh?
Well, I was thinking that was at that Arkansas conference, that ghost conference in Arkansas, which was right around 2007, I think. And we all assembled there to do filming for the Booth Brothers documentaries, along with presenting at the conference. And I still have very fond memories of that conference as well.
It was a lot of fun, and it was actually kind of groundbreaking for me as well. So I remember it fondly, in the filming and everything that went along with it. It was just a lot of fun.
Well, The Exorcist is one of those films that people remember what was going on in their lives and when and how they saw that film. It was a terrifying film for millions of people, and I remember the result of that, where people were going to counselors and religious clerics, because suddenly they were frightened by the prospect of the demonic invading their lives. And I certainly remember how I reacted to the film, and it made me look in mirrors very differently for a long time, looking in the mirrors to see what's behind you. Mm-hmm. And where were you when that film came out?
When I was young, I was really, really young. But it was interesting, Rosemary, because I was growing up in St. Louis. And being a kid here when that movie was released and that book was released was a huge deal, because, everybody talked about it and everybody continued talking about it. But it hit a little bit closer, I think, for us here in St. Louis, because we realized that this is something that was based on something that was true, that happened here in our own backyard. Makes a whole different reality to it, doesn't it, I guess? But yeah, I remember I wasn't allowed to see the film at that point, because in 1973, I was probably about 8 or 9 years old. But I remember every time you turned on the television, every time you turned on the radio, anytime you looked anywhere, magazines, newspapers, there were stories about The Exorcist and what the film was doing and the phenomenon it caused. And that was one of the things that I found interesting when I started doing some of the research, was to take a look at where the mindset was. And there's a whole part in the book where we discuss this, where the mindset was of the country at the moment that the book was released. And I thought that was really interesting, because you look at it, there was a tremendous amount of distrust going on about institutions, because you're here in, 1969, 1973, 74, when the film was released. And you're looking at Watergate, and you're looking at the mothers leaving the home for the first time. And I thought it was interesting, because one of the piece of research I found talked about the mother's guilt about leaving their children at home and going back to work, and how The Exorcist played into that guilt, and how it played into all this distrust. And you think about the impact of the history of where we were as a country at the moment that film hit, and it really struck a chord, not only on a religious point of view, but on other points of view of where we were at that point as far as the country goes.
Well, let's set some parameters here about this story. And it arguably has been called one of the most horrific demonic possession cases in modern history, and maybe in the history of demonic cases. What do you think?
Well, I think, it's actually one of the groundbreaking ones. I mean, if you want to think about possession, there's certain cases that you think about, and obviously Emily Rose is one of them, or Annalise Michel, which became the Emily Rose film. But this is one of those that I think was really kind of a benchmark case in what we view as modern day demonic. And, in one way, I actually wonder if it didn't kind of usher in the modern day demonic in a way. I have to wonder if the demonic is real, which I believe it is, by the way. If maybe, it's always 20 steps ahead of us. If maybe it's set into motions, events that maybe still could be playing a day. I mean, you said it in the opening when you said, this case is 60 plus years old. We're still talking about it. That says something. That says something very, very important. The fact that it still strikes that chord and that we're still having that discussion.
It strikes at a primal fear level in a way that other cases do not. We have a question from Lorraine in the chat room. Please, if you can, define possession without using a religious or spiritual definition.
It's difficult to do without using a religious aspect. But, from my point of view, if you would look at it, it's the taking over, the changing of the psyche in some way, whether it is from an outside source, which I believe it is, or whether it is from an internal. But there's definite changes in the psychic that happen within the person. So from a non-religious point of view, it's very hard to look at it. But I'll tell you this, though, Lorraine, it's, coming from a case of my own, which we'll get into later, that I dealt with the demonic. It really, the label demonic or the religious side of it doesn't really matter to those of us who experience it. There's a lot of answers that have not ever been answered. And I think that it's always changing in your mind, even though those of us who have survived such a thing, that at any point, you can't tell you exactly if it was religious. I would tell you it's spiritual. But the thing is if we could finally get some definitive answers at some point in life, that would be great. I don't think any of us that have actually survived it look at it from a totally religious point of view. We look at it from a more of a thing that affected us and we're not quite sure what it is. But the truth of the matter is it obviously is there, and there's a lot of people that are very much affected by it.
I think these cases involve afflictions that human beings naturally turn to spiritual remedies for. And of course, every religion, every faith has remedies and approaches for dealing with these these takeover situations, and they're all effective in their own ways. But sometimes it's still quite an ordeal for the victim. And you said very early on in confrontation with evil, that one of our greatest and most dangerous spiritual action is to deny the diabolical. And yet we do over and over again. And skeptics still deny that this boy was ever demonically possessed. And why is that dangerous for us? Well,
the fact of the matter is the balance of life is good and evil, positive, negative. We know that when dealing in non-religious issues as well. I think to take away look from what is negative or what is evil is to also take away from looking at what's positive as well. I think to put your head in the sand and say, well, these things do not exist is a little bit naive too, because I think what you do is you kind of open yourself up to the fact of, through your denial of existence, then you also become attractive at that point. I think that is a big danger, really. And I think it's unfair that we try to give a definition to something that maybe can't always be defined in terms that we know exactly what it is. I think you're right when you say that we turn to spiritual aspects just kind of naturally. So that has to tell you something as well.
Concerning the St. Louis case, you make the observation also early in confrontation with evil that researchers have tended to ask the question, why was this boy attacked? Why was this boy possessed? And your point is, we're asking the wrong question. What should we be asking? It's the place, it's the circumstances. What question should we be asking to get at the truth of this case?
I think you get caught up in the fact that it was a boy, first of all. This horrible thing happens to this child. But I think the question should be, okay, why was the devil here? Why did this thing happen? How did it happen? What were the circumstances surrounding it? Were the effects that happened to this boy already present in other ways? Were the events, in a lot of times, if you hear the story, a lot of times they claim it was the aunt's fault who taught the boy how to use a Ouija board and that sort. Those are things to look at too. I think too much is caught up in the boy. And when you talk about research, I think it's very hard at this point. We're 40-something years out from the film, right? It's very hard for people to separate that impactful film from the reality of what happened as well. I think a lot of times what we do is we forget the fact that reality often doesn't match what entertainment is. So I think it was very hard at some points for people to look at the story without actually looking at who Reagan McNeil was instead of looking at who Roland was. You see what I'm saying? It's very, very different, and it's very different to what happened. So, there's so much impact that goes into the fictional character, other than the reality of the character or the reality of the real person. I think he was made into a monster in a lot of ways, Rosemary. And I think in some ways there's been a little bit of an injustice done for him. Can you imagine what that was like growing up being that boy?
What he went through was absolutely horrific. And you do, by the way, I wanted to point out, refer to him by a pseudonym, Roland Doe, in his book, although sadly there have been some people who've released his real name. He's managed to be anonymous for most of his life. But one of the things you do is you reveal a very disturbing picture about the dynamics of his family. And that really ties in with one of the questions questions we have from John in the chat. Did any of the boys' family members have an interest in the occult? Oh boy, they did. What was going on there that might have been the gateway for this experience?
Well, it was interesting because one of the first places that I decided to look was the diary that was written by Father Raymond Bishop. Now, this diary has been out for a long time, actually. It was actually Thomas Allen told the story of Roland Doe through using the diary as well. But the thing that I found interesting about it is that was the one historical document because it wasn't written for public consumption. So I went into the diary and I started reading it, and I read it from the case of, okay, if I was a paranormal investigator and I was working a case, how would I look at this case? And I tried to separate myself as much as I could from the impact of this being the case of The Exorcist, okay? And I started reading it, and what came out of it was actually kind of shocking. Because there's a point when the activity's been going on for a while, and the diary's online; anybody can read it anywhere. But the activity's been going on for a while, and at this particular night, Roland is on his bed with his mother and his grandmother. The bed is shaking. They describe it as footsteps of marching feet going up and down the bed shaking. And they do. Now, the mother was a strict Lutheran woman, is what most of the time she's described as. But I found something really interesting during the moment that she's on this bed and this is going on. Now, the aunt had died like 2 weeks before. The aunt that everybody likes to blame this on because they say, well, she taught him how to use the Ouija board. Well, what became really interesting, though, is the mother on the bed that night, as you got the noise going and the feet steps going around, the bed shaking, she yells out, "Is this Aunt so-and-so? And if you are, can you knock 3 times? And I went, what? Wait a second. I'm like, this is a good Lutheran woman. First of all, how did she even begin to believe that it was the aunt, number one? Number two, how would she know? I mean, how many times have you been on a paranormal investigation, folks, and you heard somebody say, if you can hear me, make a noise, knock 3 times? I mean, we've all been there. We've all heard it. And I went, well, how would she know this? Now, I continue, and she does it again, and she gets response. And I'm thinking to myself, well, okay, let's look at spirituality from the fact of the spiritualism movement at the time. There were a lot of times people were going to church on Sunday and they were practicing spiritualism Monday through Saturday, right? I'm like, so let's continue. But it got interesting as you go on because at one point the mother starts asking questions. Now, she's no longer asking for knocks because words have started forming on the boy, on his body. As a matter of fact, he describes them as the feeling of branding. One of the things that they were in Cottage City, Maryland, in their home when this started, by the way. One of the questions that she asked is if she should come to St. Louis because it writes Louis on him, and she had family here. Now keep this in mind, Rosemary. When she asked this, he describes these things as being very painful. He screams. He's in pain and yelling. It's like being branded, he says. But the mother keeps asking questions.
Unbelievable.
And as a parent, I stopped and went, wait a second, something's not right here. As a parent who's been through paranormal events, disturbing ones with my children, that was the last thing I wanted to do. I wanted to grab them, protect them, get them away. She keeps asking questions, even down to the fact that she asked the question at one point, should I send him to school while we're there? How long should we stay there? It became almost the Saturday Night Live version of everything. You could almost see the skit. The mother asks the question, the kid screams out in pain, the audience laughs, and I'm like, there's something not right here. And I realized at that moment as I got into it that it seemed to me that, and there's more to back this up with, it seemed to me that it was almost like a spiritual Munchausen by proxy, possibly. even though the publisher was like, you can't say that, but I did, anyway. But,
and explain that term for folks.
Well, a lot of times the Munchausen by proxy is most of the time we see it within mothers who have sick children, and they actually cause the illness of the child because they like the attention that they get from the child's illness. In this case, it would be the mother's causing this activity, and she's causing the questioning and stuff because she likes either what she's getting out of it, which is either the answers that she was getting, or number two, the attention that it was getting, or both, is the feeling. Now, they come to St. Louis. Now, what's interesting about this, and I've skipped ahead a little bit, but to understand where her mindset is, and where this all comes from, once they get to St. Louis, it wasn't to come to see a priest. It wasn't come to get an exorcism. It wasn't any for that reason. As a matter of fact, the first thing they do when they get here is they go to an alphabet medium and they start communication again.
Stephen, I've got to jump in right here. We're at the bottom of the hour, and it's time to take our first break, and we'll find out what happens next. It's a very chilling scenario, what's going on here. So stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to Strange Dimensions on KGRAradio.com. We'll be right back.
Hey there, quick question for you. Would you be okay with more energy, more endurance, thicker, healthier hair, a better mood, reduced appearance of wrinkles, improved sleep, improved blood pressure and cholesterol profiles, improved vision, improved memory? Okay then. Well now, have you heard of Nature's Youth RSF? It's from the anti-aging experts at nature'syouth.com. nature'syouth.com. See, at Nature's Youth, they understand exactly what it means to provide top quality health products. And Nature's Youth customers not only improve their health, they know they're also providing their body with the right nourishment to maintain that peak performance and fight the aging process. If health, wellness, and nutrition are what you desire, choose Nature's Youth RSF. I did. You see, you're going to get older. It's just up to you how you feel when you get there. Get started today. Nature's Youth RSF. Simple to use, simple to order. Go to nature'syouth.com. That's nature'syouth.com. nature'syouth.com.
On the next episode of Recipes for Disaster.
So we've got our neighbor Paul coming over tonight for a barbecue, which is why I prepared a delicious lemon rosemary steak marinade from my special collection of old family recipes. To make sure the steaks are extra, extra, extra tender, I left them marinating out on the counter overnight, just like Nana used to.
Maria may mean well, but without food safety, it never ends well. Always thaw or marinate foods in the refrigerator at 40 degrees Fahrenheit or below, or you could make your friends and family really sick. Maria's neighbor Paul didn't think twice about the steak he ate until he was presenting his company's financial forecast to the board. That's when a sudden bout of food poisoning made it explicitly clear that profits weren't the only thing on the rise. Watch Recipes for Disaster at foodsafety.gov. You'll learn the right steps as Maria does everything wrong. Brought to you by the USDA, HHS, and the Ad Council.
The new word on the street is bloated. Yeah, you eat this food, GMO, herbicide, pesticide. Foods aren't safe anymore. And then we eat them and we're bloated. Our stomach says, no more, Seymour. So what we have to do is drink the tea. Are you on the tea? GetTheTea.com. That's GetTheTea.com. Super strength tea. It will help you with the new word, bloated. You can get it today. Log on to GetTheTea.com.
Your alternative talk radio contact, The Planet, KGRAradio.com.
The Lord be with you, and also with you. Let us pray. Holy Lord, Almighty Father, everlasting God, and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ,
who once and for all consigned that fallen tyrant to the flames of hell, who sent your only begotten Son into the world to crush that roaring lion, hasten to our call for help, and snatch from ruination and from the clutches of the noonday devil this human being made in your...
How's that for some creepy atmosphere? For tonight's topic, the Exorcist case, the 1949 St. Louis possession that has riveted worldwide attention for over 60 years since then. And my guest tonight, best-selling author Stephen LaChance, has spent over a decade researching this case and has come up with new evidence, shocking evidence in this case. Now, just before the break, we were talking about how the attacks have started on the boy in his Maryland home. They get instructions from a communicating spirit through the boy to go to St. Louis. And Stephen, pick it up from there.
Well, so the communication continues. They get to St. Louis. They go to see an alphabet medium. Is the first person they go to, not a priest, not the church. They went to a medium. Another spiritualist, this is the second spiritualist, because they do visit a spiritualist while they're in Maryland, as a matter of fact. So this goes on, and there's great activity that goes on during this session, by the way. Words form again. There's stuff flies across the room. I think it was a dresser that went across the room during that session. It wasn't until one of his cousins, it was a female cousin who was going to St. Louis University, which is the local university here, Catholic Jesuit. And she realized that he's in trouble and she needs to do something. So she goes to her class, which was run by Father Raymond Bishop, who wrote the diary, which is actually the document where we're reading from and we're getting a lot of things from. So she goes to him and she says, hey, this is going on. I need a priest. So Father Raymond Bishop comes out. He does it. He realizes he's in over his head. He goes back, and they decided to bring in the exorcist. So the first night, if you can imagine, the exorcist arrives. We've all seen the scene play out in the movie where the exorcist comes and there's the fog under the light and everything. And but this is why I'm getting to this point really quick. Because the first night that the exorcist arrives, the family is standing around the young boy and they're asking questions. Now, this is in Father Bishop's diary completely. And what got me is they're watching the family do this. The mother's asking questions and the family's watching now remember, these words are forming on his body. He's screaming and yelling because he's in such pain. And guess what the questions were about? Where did the dead aunt bury her money?
I just can't imagine. I cannot imagine people subjecting a child to that agony in order to try and find money that nobody even knew really existed. Mm-hmm. They just hoped.
Interesting, and the thing is the fact that it is greed, which, if we look at it from a religious standpoint, you can go, well, one of the 7 deadly sins is greed, right? It's a sin. It's the sin that, a lot of priests would tell you leads into all other sin. As a matter of fact, if you have a case that is possession or something like that and you call a priest out, I've actually seen priests tear up checks who they won't take payment for it. And the reason they don't take payment for it is because greed becomes a part of it and greed becomes play and it leads into everything else. It's probably one of the more deadly of things that you can get involved in. And, and this thing was feeding on it. I mean, you can see throughout, if we go throughout the history of the story, I mean, from the family onward, it seems like greed kind of motivates this thing anyway. So.
And you make the point in Confrontation with Evil that the victim is not always the target.
That's correct. The victim isn't always the target. A lot of times when you look at these cases, the possession, especially when you look in the case of a child, which this, when you're seeing a child that's being affected, it's usually the parent that is the target. We've seen this, and I can go through history of cases that everyone knows. I mean, and look at it, and you see every time the child is affected, it's that call to the parent to say, that something is playing there with them. Whether in this case it's greed, or in some cases it's love, and the love of a child where you would go, well, take me instead of them. Game over, invitation to the dance. In this case, it's, where's the money? The money is the total motivation for her to do the action. And the thing is to keep this in mind, it clouds all other reason. And I think in her case, it does. And at one point in the book, she becomes in the diary, she becomes very aware, I believe, of what's happening to her, because she kind of goes away from the picture for a while and kind of has a breakdown of her own, which also is a good indication she was the target as well.
Couple of questions from the chat here, Stephen. I'm going to combine them here because they relate to, we get a priest doing an exorcism pretty fast. And any paranormal investigator who's worked on demonic cases, as you have and I have, you know how hard it is to get approval for an exorcism. I mean, it's horrendous sometimes. And so we have a question from Libertas, who within the Catholic Church gave approval for the exorcism? And then Susan wants to know, what was the charge for the exorcism? Was there a charge?
No, there will be no charge for an exorcism ever, number one. Number two, it was Cardinal Ritter here in St. Louis that actually gave the approval. Now, let's go back to Maryland, because remember I told you we jumped way ahead because we wanted to tell the mother's story. Right. You'll find that there's a lot of lines of stories that go through this thing. In the beginning parts, when he was having trouble, the first person she went to a spiritualist. She went to her minister, by the way, which is interesting, with Lutheran minister. There's different stories about what happens. The boy spends the night at the Lutheran minister's house. There's some stories that say he was tied to a chair because of the activity that was going on. There's other stories that say that he was thrown under the bed. The diary really doesn't get into a whole lot of it. It's just a little bit of pre-information. But the interesting thing about the Lutheran minister is he was involved in the paranormal because he was communicating at the whole time that he was dealing with it with the Rhine Institute, which I thought was interesting as well. A Catholic priest is talked to eventually in Maryland. There's some indication at one point they say that he actually had an exorcism in Maryland. There's a big controversy about this, and you'll get it. I get into it in the book, and I tell both sides of it because really the truth of the matter is the diary says it didn't happen. The diary actually, if you look at the diary, says that the boy is taken to St. Louis just as approval comes through for an exorcism in Maryland, and it never happens in Maryland. Now, there's a story that was based that was somebody that was in the room in Georgetown University that claims an exorcism happened where the exorcist, who was very unqualified to be doing it, was actually cut by a bed spring. His arm, it was like 100-something stitches, but it had affected him the rest of his life. There's those things. But I will tell you this, the one document that tells the story is the diary, and the diary says it didn't happen. So you kind of have to weigh it out on your own.
And this is the diary.
I'm sorry?
Oh, I just wanted to clarify that this is the diary of one of the priests who was involved in the exorcisms.
This was Father Raymond Bishop who assisted. Now, the actual exorcist on the case was the priest from the St. Xavier College Church here in St. Louis, which is just up the street from where I live right now. But his name was Father Bauder. And it gets interesting as you get into the story a little bit about him and how it affects him in his life. But yeah, I thought it was interesting because, there were other people that looked at this case. But what I found most interesting about this is when you look at everything before they meet the St. Louis Father Bishop, Before that happens, it seems like everybody beforehand is either they don't know what they're doing. They're kind of like bumbling characters in a way. And actually, it's all of the people that this boy, and this is part of possession and what it is and how it works. And all of these people were the people that should have been there for him and the people that should have offered him the guidance and the people that he should have been able to rely on. And every single one of them in some way or another lets him down. And I found that really disturbing. And at that point, if you read at the beginning of the book, you'll see the book's dedicated to him, the boy. And the reason it was dedicated to, who is now an adult, obviously, is because I had to feel for him because I felt like so many people had not done right by him. And I think that was the case up until the point he gets here.
Well, why do you think he was so vulnerable to be the person who was attacked?
Well, I think it started. Well, I think it started with the Ouija board. I think now, mind you, when I say I think, I'm not giving you fact. I mean, the I think part here is we look at it. It appears the mother had some knowledge of spiritualism. I imagine I think it's pretty safe to say she was probably experimenting on her own, which opens a doorway. Now, the doorway to be opened was through the boy. The boy actually at one point, and I get into a lot of this in the book too, where we discuss the oracle and what the oracle is and what the importance of the planchette and how the boy actually became a human planchette at one point. And I think he was more... in the beginning stages, I think he became more of the human planchette, Rosemary, than he was anything else. He was there to affect them to take that mother down that road. And once she was down that road, there's a point of no turning back. And I think then it became more of a battle between the boy and the priest. But that wasn't the intent in the beginning.
So after they get to St. Louis and he comes more under the, I guess we would say, the care of the Jesuits, then does this balance shift then in another direction? Does the family become more out of the picture?
Right. You see the mother kind of fall away after the father arrives. The father actually does arrive finally. He doesn't come to St. Louis originally. So, and that was, speaking of that, you see the mother shortly after that, she kind of falls away. So I think she probably, and I think it's pretty safe to say she had a breakdown of her own. Maybe, and I'm hoping, and I think history kind of showed later on, she became a very Catholic woman. But I think what happened at one point is she probably looked and realized what she had done, And then it was a battle between, it set up this ultimate battle between good and evil. You had the Jesuits on one hand and whatever this evil thing was on the other. And you had that fight that was going back and forth in the trying to figure out what it means and what it's doing and what they're doing. And it kind of gets really interesting at that point. But she does. It does kind of shift. And she does fall away. And at that point, I think it becomes more about the battle between good and evil. And the boy is just always seems to be, doesn't he just seem to be stuck in the middle of all this at all given times? It really does feel that way.
He does. He seems to be a pawn in a game that he has absolutely no control over and probably very little awareness of what exactly is going on.
Well, that's the interesting part of it is his awareness. I mean, you could, and they describe it, there's times when he is described as a very normal boy, what you would expect for, a 13, 14-year-old. He's very normal. He's doing very normal things and, he could be laughing and playing and then all of a sudden he goes under and it changes. And when it changes, it's something, then he's saying the most vile things that you could ever hear. And one of the things that I found most chilling about that is when he starts to sing. And the voice that he sings in a beautiful voice, they say, a beautiful singing voice. The boy couldn't sing at all, by the way. beautiful singing voice. He would sing Swanee and the Blue Danube, that's, the Old Rugged Cross I thought was interesting that he sang.
Sort of things that would throw somebody off balance, because then, horrible things would come out of him.
Absolutely.
How many exorcisms did he go through in total?
Oh, gosh, I couldn't tell you. It was so many different ones, and sometimes
there went over years. Well,
no, it seems like it does when you're reading it, but it's not. That's the interesting part of it. It starts, he gets here in February, and the Monday after Easter that year, it's over. So you're talking about 2 months, 2.5 months.
Oh, I thought things reoccurred in up to 1951.
Well, there's indications, but when you're dealing with the diary portion of this, and you're dealing with that, he is fine up until Easter is when the Monday after Easter is when the big event happens, where we'll get into that, by the way, where you have the bilocation event that happens that actually he is freed at that point. 1951, he actually ends up becoming his family. They all become Catholics by that point. Mm-hmm. And I think, obviously, and when you're dealing with cases like this, Rosemary, this. I mean, it's you have that big event that you could say it's over here, but you have the aftershocks that happen afterwards. It always is trying to get back in. I would not be surprised if it's still trying to get back in where this guy's concerned.
Well, that is one thing that the experts, the demonologists say about these cases is that the victims have to be diligent their entire lives to prevent a reentry, because that doorway is very easily opened again.
And I think, to understand that, and then to understand, when he was probably, what you think, in his 30s by the time the film hit, I'm sure that energy and that amount of attention that was placed upon it at that point, I'm sure he dealt with some things at that point even as well.
We do have a question, now that you bring that up, from Heidi, as to whether or not he was involved in the movie in any way, or did he stay completely away?
No. If you were to ask him, anybody that has gotten the opportunity to talk to him, he'll tell you he doesn't remember anything.
How true do you think that is?
Well, I think he probably remembers some of it. There's parts of, I do understand blackouts and how those work, and you don't always know what you do during the points of blackout. But there's some of it he has to remember. I think a lot of that is probably a protective thing, because I think sometimes we forget that these are the most difficult points of our lives. And so it's easy to say, I don't remember it, so nobody has to make me talk about that. And I think maybe that's a little bit of it. And I can understand that.
Now, the suffering that he endured was absolutely horrific, and it involved excruciating pain, nausea, vomiting, fits, seizure-like fits.
Urination, it was very hard for him to urinate even. Not to be crass or whatever, but it was to the point of even that was horrific. It was burning. When you stop and you consider, you have these words now, you have pictures, you have X's that are appearing, and you have all this stuff going on with him. And, to stop and think of what he looks like at any given point, I found that pretty shocking. Now, interesting enough, and I want, it's a good time to contrast it too, because you have Father Baldwin, who's the exorcist. His brother, by the way, was a physician. And during the exorcism, there is points that he would go see his brother because he had oozing boils that were all over his body, by the way. And I thought that was very in contrast. You see, there's a scene near the end of The Exorcist where he's lost this tremendous amount of weight. You know he's got these boils all over his body, but he is on this bedside with this child who is, scarred up, scratched up. He's vomiting, he's vile, he's got all these other things going on with him. And he's sitting there on the edge of the bed, and he's praying for him. And to me, that was one of those moments that I wish they would have put in a film somewhere, to show the compassion this man had and the willingness that he had to sacrifice his own well-being for this child. I thought it was quite stunning and quite shocking at the same time.
Well, all of the priests, and there was a Mr. Halloran there too, who wasn't a priest at that point, but they were all deeply affected by what they were witnessing, as well as what they were doing.
What's interesting is when you get into whether they will talk about it or not, the majority will not. Father Bowder went pretty much to his grave pretty tight-lipped. So did Father Bishop. Which I thought was interesting. Now, Mr. Halloran, who became a priest later, he was interesting, though, Rosemary, because when I got into his research, he would tell people what they wanted to hear at any given moment, and I had to address that in the book, because there's times when he would say one thing, and then there was times when he would say another. So that was interesting to me. It was like he was trying to keep people off kilter. But what's interesting about Father Halloran, his main job was to hold the boy down. He was the muscle, basically, the best way to describe him. And his job was to hold the boy down. But 5 days before the exorcism is complete, interestingly enough, and I think this is what affected Father Halloran more than anything, they pulled him from the case. And it's never really stated totally why he's pulled. And I think it always bothered him that 5 days before the completion of the exorcism, which this huge event happens at the completion, by the way, that I think it always bothered him that he was not allowed to be there for it for whatever reason. And obviously we get into that in a little bit more in the book a little later as well.
How reliable can we view Father Bishop's diary?
Well, I look at Father Bishop's diary this way, and I think it's probably the most reliable piece of information you're going to find out there on this. And the reason for that is because it was never meant for public consumption. This was an internal document. It was written to be an internal document, and that's what its purpose was. So from that point of view, you look at it from that point of view and you realize, okay, this is probably the most reliable history you're going to find as far as a written history. You got the boy who says, I don't remember. You got Father Halloran, who's kind of wishy-washy on things. The other guys kind of, are kind of quiet. They don't really want to talk about it. As a matter of fact, I saw an interview once where one of them was just absolutely almost combative that he didn't want to talk about it. And so it's interesting to me that the diary stands as probably the most reliable source. And I think we all realize this. I think, the other people who've written books also realize the impact of the diary and how historical of a document it actually becomes at that point, and the reason why.
Now, the boy is moved around to several locations in St. Louis, and there's a rectory, the uncle's house, and the Alexis Hospital. And where did the final exorcism take place?
Now, that's interesting because if you see an interview from Father Halloran later in life, he actually slips up and he says St. Xavier. The exorcism was actually held at St. Alexian Brothers Hospital on South Broadway in St. Louis, Missouri. At the same moment that it was held on the fourth floor of a wing of the hospital that no longer exists. By the way, they've torn that down. But at the moment that it's happening, at St. Louis Alexian Brothers here on Broadway. Across town, you got St. Xavier's College Church, and there's a little confusion that happens there because there's two events that happen at the same moment. St. Michael arrives, and he has one word he has to say, and the demon is said. It's very dramatic, by the way. The demon has said all along that if you say this one word, I'll have to go. And the word turns out to be dominus, right? And so St. Michael comes with the word dominus, right? And if you listen to what people say at the church, they talk at the hospital, they talk about there's a cross on top of the hospital that's struck by lightning. There's a loud boom in the hospital. They're shaking. There's this big dramatic moment. Now, you go across town to St. Xavier's College Church, which I guess you would say was about 4 miles apart. You have the brothers praying in the rectory of the church, and St. Michael appears in the dome. It's a half dome above the altar of the church. He appears in that in a bright white light, and it's this tremendous moment that happens here and there. And neither one of those places are considered a religious place, which I'm not quite sure about. We get into that in the book, It's anywhere else that St. Michael would appear, there'd be plaques and statues and everything else, but nothing like that in St. Louis, and supposedly this big event. Now, the cross, interesting enough, is kept at the City Museum, which is just like, if I looked out the window, Rosemary, I'd see the City Museum out my window of our loft here. It's just right down the street. And the cross that was struck by lightning, they keep enshrined there. But interesting, you had these two events. Now, to me, that's a big religious moment. I'm sorry.
Got to jump in again for the top of the hour break. Got to take those breaks, but we're coming up on the climax to this, the final exorcism, and then the aftermath of that, which is just as intriguing as the final event itself. So do stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. Strange Dimensions on KGRAradio.com. We'll be right back with my guest tonight, Stephen LaChance.
I'm getting older and noticing that my body just doesn't work as well as it used to. So I like to keep fit as possible by hitting the gym a few times a week. Recently, I started having a nagging bicep pain, and it got so bad I couldn't even lift the weights. When I was complaining about it to a friend, he told me about Angioprim. He said chelation helps remove toxins, heavy metals, and cholesterol in veins and arteries that may cause blockages. After just 1 week of taking Angioprim, the pain was gone, and now I'm back in the gym full strength. Scientific research proves the active ingredient in Angioprim has superior oral chelation action that helps promote cardiovascular health. So to learn more, go to angioprim.com. That's ANGIOPRIM.com, or talk to a trained consultant. Call Angioprim toll free at 877-882-7221. You'll feel better with more energy. Call 877-882-7221 or go to the website angioprim.com.
Every 2 seconds, someone needs blood. Whether it's a natural disaster or one single child suffering from illness, the American Red Cross stands ready to supply blood when it's most needed. But blood is a perishable product. Therefore, it must continuously be replenished. You can safely donate blood every 56 days. The need is constant and patients are waiting. Call your American Red Cross at 1-800-GIVE-LIFE to schedule your life-saving appointment. Please give blood today. Patients are depending on you.
KGRAradio.com is your conference connection station.
Hi, this is Ray Hobbs with KGRA Radio calling for Kendra.
This is Kendra.
Kendra, recently you went to KGRAradio.com and clicked on the contest tab and registered to win a cruise. Is that right?
You bet I did.
Kendra, you're a winner.
No, you're kidding. Are you serious?
Kendra, you and a guest will enjoy 7 days and nights aboard the beautiful Norwegian Breakaway cruise ship as you depart from New York City, headed for the fabulous Bermuda Islands.
Wow, Ray.
You and your guest are going to get the KGRA VIP experience with a private cocktail reception with all the speakers. You're going to get VIP passes for all the lectures, presentations, panels, Q&A sessions.
Wow.
You're going to get dinner with keynote speaker Eric Von Daniken, Nick Redfern, and and Micah Hanks at sea.
It's amazing. Oh, man. I can't even believe it. That's so exciting.
Also included are 2 exclusive shore excursions with speakers on the gorgeous Sunset Catamaran Cruise, and you're going to get to see another side of Bermuda's nightlife aboard the glass-bottom boat on the beautiful Twilight Cruise, and a whole lot more. What do you think, Kendra?
Oh, my gosh. I don't even believe this. I never win anything. This is amazing, Ray. I love KGRA.
All of this is provided by your friends at Holiday Maker Travel, Kendra, and KGRA Radio, valued at over $3,000. You're a winner.
It's amazing.
Kendra, who is your contact for the best UFO paranormal talk radio on the planet, sweetheart?
KGRAradio.com.
You listen to us, and we listen to you. And so does the CIA. KGRAradio.com.
And of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, by this sign of the Holy Cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with the Father and the
Chilling sounds from the final exorcism scene in the 1973 film The Exorcist, based on the real-life case we're talking about tonight, the 1949 St. Louis possession of a young boy. My guest tonight, best-selling author Stephen LaChance, who spent more than a decade unearthing new and shocking information about this case. And Stephen, just before the last break, we were coming right up on the final exorcism of the boy himself, and St. Michael is at hand. One question I have is, we can imagine from the film that the real exorcism probably had a lot of horrific sounds and sights in it as well. Did anybody document this with magnetic tape recordings or photographs?
What I've heard, and there's inklings, and that's all. And there's other ways that have indicated it too, that there might be photographs somewhere.
But no one has ever seen them?
No, but well, the Basilica here in St. Louis is probably where they're at. And I'm just going to say, if I could ever, let me put it this way, protect myself, but if I could ever get into the Basilica, into the archives, that's maybe where they'd be found.
Sort of like the vaults at the Vatican.
Actually, yes.
Now, so the Archangel St. Michael is on hand for the final expulsion of this demonic entity. How did the angel become involved? And why wasn't the angel called in earlier?
Well, I think they were all, obviously, if they were doing the exorcism right, they were calling on St. Michael, who obviously is the archangel that battles the demon. We know this. So I think, he finally shows up because he realizes that, whatever purpose is served, I guess. It's hard to say. But what I find interesting about it, though, is we spend so much time in this life talking about the devil and the demon, and what happened in the bad or the evil, whichever way you want to label it. But very little has been ever said or talked about the sacrifice that these men made, and the fact that in the last moment, probably one of the more miraculous things that have ever happened in religious history in the United States happened here in St. Louis, and it's never talked about. Father Bowder, by the way, who, he lost massive amounts of weight. He had boils. There's indications that he dealt with this for the rest of his life. Has never been canonized or brought up for any type of sainthood or any kind of recognition in that way, which also leads you to believe why. And interesting enough is when you get into some of this, in a lot of ways, they would rather not talk about it. I mean, honestly, it was to the point of it's very hard. It's like pulling teeth They'll do seminars on it, but it's to convince you that you know everything that you need to know on it, which I found was very interesting. And then the other point of that is true, and I said this earlier, St. Michael made an appearance at that church in front of 35 priests, brothers. At that point, 35 people see St. Michael at the church. You have all these events that happen in the hospital. The brothers, the Alexian brothers, see what goes on there. Neither one of these places has ever been considered a holy place, which doesn't make sense when you look at the history of the church. I mean, how many places have you realize? And you realize the importance of relics in the church as well. It just doesn't make sense that these places aren't considered valuable historical places where the faithful are concerned.
It's almost like the church wishes that this case would dry up and go away. And probably if it hadn't been for Peter Blatty discovering it and turning it into an international bestseller, that would have been the case.
And that's probably true. And, but I look at, even when you look at Blatty, he really thought in every interview that you'll ever read from him, about why he did it, he really thought that he was bringing religion or spirituality to the younger masses. He felt that people were falling away from the Catholic Church. He was a huge Catholic himself, by the way. And I think, his intent was to bring the masses to the church. But in some ways, I think what he ended up doing, and it's quite frightening if you think about it, is he ended up bringing the devil to the forefront and actually making a superstar of the devil himself.
And fear is a very strange way to bring spirituality to people.
Absolutely. You and I know. And you and I know how counterproductive that is. But, yeah, it's a strange way. And I think it backfired on him drastically in some negative terms.
Well, now, getting back to the final exorcism here, where this entity is finally expelled from Roland, something else happened that isn't really talked about that you uncovered during your investigation, and what's that?
Well, now, before I start this, when we were on a break, you and I were having a discussion, and I told you, I've written this book. It's been covered by the New York Post. The New York Post did 3 pages on it. The Sun in Great Britain, which is one of the biggest papers in the UK, did 4 pages on it. Obviously, a lot of attention placed upon it in a lot of different places. And the Catholic Church has never said a word about it, which is good. Because if I would have gotten anything wrong that I've written, they are the first ones to jump on it. As a matter of fact, when they did the exorcism of the house years ago on Halloween, the St. Louis Archdiocese was all over that. Trust me. They are the first ones to jump on things like that. They have been silent. Now, the reason for this is because of what I'm about to tell you. And I knew this story. Now, growing up in St. Louis, you have to understand that this becomes lifeblood, the urban legends that are here that people talk about, the stories that you hear, and the inklings of things you hear. Now, I've always heard the inkling that there was another hospital that was important to this case, and not because Roland stayed at the hospital, because there was a priest that was held on a floor of the hospital. It was the insane asylum, the mental health ward, which is the 4th floor of this hospital. So anyway, what's interesting is I'm asked to go to that during my own haunting. And I was looking for answers. Now, the question is, why would you go? Well, number one, at that point, we were going through some pretty severe stuff ourselves. And this will be a good lead-in eventually to the uninvited, I guess. But the reason I went is I was looking for answers of what was happening to myself and my family. And this person took us, and I'm not going to tell you who, and I don't say in the book, and it's actually kind of, I guess I always laughed when I was writing it. I said, this is like the paranormal deep throat. But they take me to this hospital, and I go to the hospital, and I go to get on the elevator, and I wanted to get on the regular elevator, but they took me down a hallway, and they opened a regular-looking door. Behind this door was a green metal door. It was an elevator. that you would not have ever expected, by the way. It was very small. Only like 3 people could fit into this little bitty elevator. And we go up to the 4th floor. Up on the 4th floor, there's a hallway. Now, this whole floor is deserted in this hospital. The calendars, and I'll show you pictures, Rove, at some time. The calendars say 1983, which, if anything, if you do the math on the exorcism and dates, the 1983 makes sense. But it was weird, though, because it was like, I mean, there were pens on the desk. Like, people got up and just left this floor. Now, I walked down the hall, and as I'm walking down the hall, there's a day room to the side of me, and there's windows. And as I'm walking down the hall, I'm hearing a knocking on the windows. Now, I know where I'm at because I have been told stories, and I had talked to people who had been on this mental ward where this was, and I knew who they housed on this mental ward, which is a priest. And the priest that they housed on the mental ward, I don't think we'll ever know his name, but I will tell you this, he was part of the exorcism. And Peter Blatty was not wrong when he said that the demon went into the priest, because a demon did go into the priest. And this is the secret they've been hiding for years.
He took the bullet.
He took the bullet. Now, whether he knew he was taking the bullet or it just happened, that remains to be seen. But I go down this hallway, and now, mind you, there's knocking on the day windows as I'm going, and I'm thinking, well, maybe it's my walking. I put my hand on one of those windows, and something knocks on my hand on the other side. Now, there's a pair of double doors that are at the end of the hall. I'm 6'7", people. So when my stride, you're going to walk like 3 steps to my 1. And so I got to this double door, and I went to push on the double door, which the windows were covered with a paper. And I went to push on the double door, and they told me, no, I couldn't go in there because that's where they housed the priest. They not only housed this priest there, and the last thing the priest said before he died was interesting, because he grabbed his nurse by her throat and said it was quite foul. He was going to strangle her, and then he died. But behind, if you put your ear to this door, you would hear things moving around. Now, I was told that they often did a lot of paranormal experiments. They were experimenting on this priest. They were experimenting. Was
it the church?
It was the church. It was the church that was doing it. And I think, and I found, and you go out and you start looking for things, and, you talk, there's a whole sect of priests that talk about how the church used evil as a game preserve. Like they figured out a way to keep it enclosed. And I believe this is the case they're talking about when they talk about that, because I think what they thought they would do is, once they had it in this priest, they thought they could study it and begin to understand it more. And I think that's what was going on there until his death in 1983. And then obviously at that point you have this floor that you can't put any patients on afterwards. And it's still there today.
That's bone chilling. Now, we do know that there is a hazard in an exorcism of the expelled entity jumping into someone else. That's a very real danger.
It's very
real. So here we have this dramatic expulsion of this horrific entity from Roland. And it goes, evidently, the evidence is there, that it goes into an unnamed priest, who then is kept for the rest of his life as a guinea pig.
Yeah. And that's frightening. Now, if you get into a lot of the cover-up, there's a lot of smoke screens, as far as location goes, locations, this location, that location, part of that just happens in the urban legendness of things. I think that happens, but I think a lot of it is used as smoke screens because they didn't want this talked about. They really didn't want this known. And the fact of the matter is that it is there. There is certain people in the community at large that do understand and do know it. Patients that stayed on that floor I've actually talked to before they cleared the floor. The patients were kept to one side of the floor, and the priest was kept by himself on the other side, by the way. So, I mean, this has always been indication. So it's really interesting. In the sacrifice, there again, you know, you have a situation where somebody actually gave their life. So this thing could be examined and investigated and understood, maybe. And I think it's a story that needs to be told. And I thought, man, I had a really hard time about if I was going to tell it or not, because I realized I could step in the fire on this one. But I think it needed to be told. And it was quite clear by the attitude of the church itself. Because the first thing they do, if you say something that wasn't true, they would be on you, and they have not said a word. So
this priest
would be the case.
You probably struck a very deep nerve on that one. Mm-hmm. So this priest probably participated in the exorcisms all along, and mm-hmm. then was officially expunged from the record.
Yeah, it's interesting because I can make theories about what priest it might have been. I mean, because, but to actually say it was one or the other, it wasn't. We know it wasn't the exorcist himself, Father Bowdern. We know it wasn't Father Bishop. We know it wasn't Father Van Root. But there's there's like 30 something different priests and brothers that came in contact. That could be any of them. I imagine if it was somebody they picked to do this, you're not going to find any family or anything. And I imagine if it happened at the moment and it just absolutely jumped into it, I have a feeling you wouldn't know anyway. They were that inept at hiding it. And I think that was really interesting. I think a lot of this is not something... is the church as a whole. There's a lot of secrets, and there's a lot of people that know the answers to a lot of these secrets, and whether they're ever told or not will remain to be seen. But in this case, I think we pretty much got a pretty good indication of what happened here.
Well, one can certainly wonder whether or not this might have been planned and deliberate. I mean, here you have a church, an institution pitted against a very powerful demonic entity. Exorcisms are failing. Mm-hmm. And since it is well known that you might entice an entity out to jump into something else, that maybe that was a solution.
Well, yeah. Just to save a young boy, I mean, you can't look at it as totally maniacal. I don't think they did it for evil purposes or bad purposes. I mean, You had a child that was affected. If they could save this child, they would do, at that point, they were willing to do anything that they possibly could to do this.
It might have been an act of desperation.
Absolutely an act of desperation. And no wonder they would want to try to hide that. I don't blame them for that. And I don't think any of us can. I think the point of the matter is they ended up saving this boy's life, who ended up growing into a rocket scientist for NASA, by the way, who lives this long life. He's still alive today, so I feel for him. And I understand why the church did what they did. They did a very humane thing by doing.
Now, at the end, then the boy recovers and goes home with his hand. Does he go back to Maryland then?
He goes back to Maryland, and he lives with his mother and his father. They actually become Catholic at one point. They become Catholic. Give the exact date of it offhand. I couldn't tell you. I think it is 1951, by the way. They become Catholic on Christmas, actually. The mother and father. Now the boy, he becomes Catholic during the ordeal. But he goes back home. Now, interestingly enough, there are inklings, like we said, of things trying to get back in. But the story and the line that you will hear is he doesn't remember anything. And like we said, I think it's more of a protection than anything.
And do you think that he recovered and became as normal as he could, that he was carrying on with a normal life?
What's interesting about that is Rosemary, he became a scientist for NASA. So he had to have tremendous security clearances, somebody that was mentally unstable, they're not going to give a whole lot of clearance to,
Exactly.
So to just the fact of what he becomes in life says a lot about his ordeal. Says a lot about who he was as a person, because that's the question, because you do get that, by the way. People will ask, they'll go, well, do you think that he was just mentally unstable? Well, no, I really don't, because he ends up becoming a scientist for NASA. So if he was a mental case, he would have never passed his security clearances. I think it says a lot for him, by the way.
Were there more than one demonic entities in Roland, or was it one big, powerful one? And who was it? Was it ever identified?
Well, it calls itself Legion. There's questions about how many at one given point, and the X marks the spot. Is there 4? I think there at one point it's more an indication there was more like 40. It's either 40 individual demons or 40 legions itself. But I think it's interesting anytime you're dealing with these kind of things. And I think you see the different personalities come out. And it's a lot of indication that there's more than one. We actually get into in the book about the possibility of who it could be. Actually, I ended up, have you ever read the book of Judas?
Yes, I have.
Very interesting, right?
Yes, it is.
It led me down that road, by the way. So it was like this thing was, I get into this writing and I would go into one part of research, and you know how that is. And then all of a sudden the research would start veining out into different areas. And the next thing you know, you're on this road and you're going down something you never thought you would go into. But the idea of Judas was really interesting at one point because of something the church had said about, we got to be careful not to demonize these people. And then I got to thinking, well, wait a second. Now, when we were dealing with Annalise Michelle, I remember Annalise Michelle came out with Judas. And then I got into the conversations and it led into the book of Judas and all that. But it's so interesting how these things will take you down so many different roads. And I suggest anyone do it. And that's why for the first time, you'll see that I put a bibliography to this book to tell you where I got research from, because I want you to go in and I want you to take this journey for yourself and find your own journey, because this story is so much more than just about this one case and this one boy in 1949. This story can take you down a lot of different avenues and a lot of different ways to learn about different things.
Now, the hospital wing where some of these exorcisms took place was demolished in 1978. The rectory in 1966. Were these just normal acts of construction, change, and expansion, or were they deliberately brought down?
I think. Well, it was, I know better. It's what got interesting is in the book. And, I had a lot more people come forward to tell their stories of the hospital floor than I put in the book. A lot of compelling stories. There was a lot of activity that was going on that 4th floor. And there was a security guard, by the way, in that hospital that liked to expose people to that floor, which was interesting to me. And it was, and I think, just the attraction to it and understanding the film and stuff and the attention it brought to that hospital, I think what it did is they decided, okay, let's back away from this. Let's get rid of this. But what's interesting about it is they demolish the wing of the hospital where the floor is. Now, guess what? It's a parking lot where the wing of the hospital is. And at the point where the 4th floor is, and I've been there, directly above And if you look where you're standing, you can always tell where it is because there's a crack in the pavement that they can't fill. And it's funny to see it because you could tell they're continually trying to fill it, and it never gets filled. It always comes back. And supposedly that correlates to the floor the boy was on. And by all picture indications, it does.
Didn't you do some ghost box sessions there in the parking lot?
Yeah. I did. I had a hard time with that, by the way, whether we were going to or not. And I decided to go ahead. And there's part of me that wishes I wouldn't have done it, but there's part of me that was glad I did. But one of the indications that, there was a question about that I asked, and actually you'll see the transcripts of those are in the appendix of the book, is, I asked what it thought of the boy, and in no certain terms, it let us know that it didn't like the boy at all.
Said we hated that damn boy.
I was trying to be nice about it, but yeah, it sure did. And that was shocking. And it was, it wasn't a nice voice. It was like, we hate it. I'm like, all of a sudden I get this. And it was very clear. It was very distinct. You think I have a low voice, people? This voice would send a freaking chill up your spine instantly. It was pretty creepy. It was pretty creepy. Rick's over on the couch doing it right now because he was there for it.
Now, you also got a heavyweight demon name, too, Belial. Do you think that this demonic entity was involved?
What's interesting about it is I think it could have been. And I really do. It does have some of the indications. But what was interesting about this, and you'll love this segue, what was interesting about that, when the Catholic Church did the report on the haunting that, was my haunting, which was the uninvited, was about, it was a 156-page report they did. The final page talks about Belial, and that's who they thought the demon was to the Union Screaming House haunting. What was interesting is Belial came out numerous times during the investigation portion of this book. And I found that kind of chilling. And I don't know if I believe it was probably the case, but I don't know. I can't tell you 100% if it wasn't trying to play with me at that moment, too.
Well, there is so much deception that goes on. It does get very difficult to discern what really is true.
Right.
But nonetheless, it is interesting evidence. Did the family ever find that fortune that they were desperately looking for?
There's questions that go around it, and the amount of money actually comes up in different things, and even in ghost box sessions, it was like $75,000. And there is no indication in the diary that tells us they actually found the fortune. That's
a sad note on the case.
Yeah. It really is a sad note. And, and the thing is so it kind of makes you want to go to the aunt's house in Richmond Heights and go on a digging spree in the yard. And who's ever living there, I'm hoping they're listening to me, because you could have a fortune in your backyard for all we know.
They've probably already done that. Hey, we've got to take our last break of the evening. You're listening to Strange Dimensions Radio. My excellent guest tonight, Stephen LaChance, on the fascinating 1949 St. Louis possession case. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. KGRAradio.com.
Okay, nurse, let's get this man to the ER stat.
Right away, doctor.
We see this every day. Heart attack or angina pain due to blocked and clogged arteries. Chelation can remove obstructions or blockages from arteries and help avoid painful and expensive surgery. Now there's Angioprim. It's a liquid oral chelation product that you take with juice. You start to feel the results fast. Angioprim increases blood flow all over the body, and that means more energy and strength to take on the day with less aches and pains. 60 years of research has gone into chelation. And Angioprim is the result, a safe and easy way to unblock your veins and arteries from buildup that slow circulation.
Paging Dr. Jones. Please report to the emergency room right away.
Log on now for a special radio offer from Angioprim. That's angioprim.com/radio. ANGIOPRIM. Angioprim.com/radio or call 877-882-7221. That's 877-882-7221.
Around the world for decades have come high strangeness reports of mysterious aerial lights, beams, animal mutilations, human abductions, secret space and military programs focused on an alien presence. One reporter of these Earth mysteries is Emmy Award-winning TV producer, writer, and editor Linda Moulton Howe. She reports and edits the science, environment, and real X-Files news website, earthfiles.com.
We are moving from the paradigm that we are alone in the universe to a new one in which we are not alone. And something out there is interacting with us, our animals and plant life, forcing glimpses of other realities upon us.
Linda has produced 4 large books about these phenomena with hundreds of color images and illustrations that reviewers such as New York Times best-selling author Jim Marrs describes as an amazing accumulation of evidence. All her books, An Alien Harvest, the 2-volume Glimpses of Other Realities, and Mysterious Lights and Crop Circles, along with documentaries, are available in the shop at earthfiles.com.
You wanted to see me?
Yes, please, have a seat. So here's the thing. When this company brought you on, we took a chance on you. You didn't have that 4-year college degree we typically look for.
Right.
But we gave you a shot anyway. And since then, you've worked incredibly hard and given it your all.
Thanks.
You've been an important asset to the team, but I don't think you can be an intern here anymore. We want to hire you.
You're serious?
Absolutely.
Find your next great employee. Introduce yourself to the Grads of Life. Who are they? Talent worth knowing about. Young adults of unique determination and experience. An ideal fit for your company in an entry-level position, internship, or even mentorship. They might not have every qualification you typically look for, but they're exactly who your company needs.
I won't let you down.
I know.
Don't miss out on a resource many innovative companies have already discovered. Go to gradsoflife.org to learn how to find, cultivate, and train this great pool of untapped talent. Brought to you by the Ad Council and gradsoflife.org.
KGRAradio.com is your conference connection station.
The power of Christ compels you. He brought you low by his blood-stained cross. Do not despise my command because you know me to be a sinner. God himself who commands you. The majestic Christ who commands you. God the Father commands you. God the Son commands you.
Are you going to keep your lights on tonight, folks? We have been delving into some very dark and disturbing territory, and certainly those sound effects from the Exorcist film add to the chill about what we're discussing, demonic possession, and how people become targets and exploited in these cases as well. My guest tonight, best-selling author Stephen LaChance, his book, Confrontation with Evil, the true story about this case. New information available worldwide in bookstores. Go to Stephen's website, stephenlachance.com, to find out more about his events and other projects. Stephen, what happened to you the first day that you sat down to write this book?
Well, you know, I write with music. I don't know if you do, but I do. And I'm listening to Ave Maria because it's, you know, if when you read the book, you'll understand why. So I'm listening to Ave Maria. I got it on a loop on the computer, and I'm writing, and it's calm, and it's nice. And I look over, and at that point, I was living in a house, and Elliot's dog, which was a border collie, she's big, she was pacing back and forth, and she'd go to the stairs, and she'd look up the stairs, and she'd growl, and she'd walk back. She'd go to the stairway, she'd look up the stairs, and she'd growl. So I even at one point go upstairs thinking, well, maybe somebody got in. It's broad daylight. She continues this. So we got Ave Maria playing, the dog's pacing back and forth. All of a sudden, there's a knock on the door. I get up and I go to the door. I open the door, and there's two guys at the door, and they say, "Do you have Jesus in your life?" I said, "You have got to be kidding me." And shut the door. Immediately went to pick up the phone, called my publishing editor, and went, "We're writing the right book." True story. First day of writing.
Talk about a synchronicity. That is amazing. Well, there are some people who would have folded up their tent and gone home, but I know you'd never do that.
No, we continued, but that was the first day. So there you go.
So in the aftermath of this, as you're doing your research and you're taking the ghost box around, you're picking up the number 6 a lot, and numbers played into the actual possession case as well. Why do demons want to play games with numbers?
You know, we get into a lot of the numerology of things and how, you know, mathematics and numbers are part of the universe, and obviously we all know that. But there's a lot of meaning in numbers. A lot of biblical meaning in numbers, like it will use a number, but it's not necessarily giving you just that number. If you look at, like, especially when you deal with demonic, you know, how many times this is mentioned in the Bible, how many times this is done in the Bible. There is definite reasons and like riddles. I often think of it this way. Remember the Riddler from Batman?
Yes.
The Riddler, he would a lot of times he'd do his little riddles, and a lot of times they deal with numbers. There's your demon. Does the same thing.
Heidi from the chat room wants to know have there been any cases that come close to the St. Louis haunting since it happened worldwide?
Annalise Michel, for one.
That also was a chilling case from Germany in the 70s, I believe that was.
I looked at a little bit of that. Well, obviously, one of the things that I wanted to look at was her reference to Judas at one point in her case. But yeah, I think hers is really a trademark. There was a case in Iowa, I believe, beforehand with a nun. That's pretty interesting as well. There's cases all the way through history that dotted that seem to be interesting when you start dealing with these things. But Annalise, I think, is equivalent to this one. I don't think a lot of these cases get, and I think this is important to point out too. I don't think a lot of times you get the entertainment side of it, these cases like The Exorcist and all that. I don't think it lessens the experience of those people that live through these things. Not everything becomes a movie.
That's right. And as you point out in the book, that this is an internal struggle. And when it comes to making a film, it has to be visually dramatic. And so the audience has to be able to see that internal struggle. And so that gets exaggerated. Let's see, Libertas wants to know what are some of the major differences between reality and the movie? How accurate was the movie?
The movie, I think, when you look at it, what you're seeing when she goes under full-blown possession. I think what you're seeing, and there's some indications in some interviews too, but what he was doing was he was showing you all the possibilities of things that could happen in possession. So Regan McNeil in the bed at that moment when she's under full-blown possession, she's doing things that you would see in like 50 different cases or more. She is the epitome of all the possibilities of what exorcism or possession could be. The boy did some very frightening things, and things moved around the room and he levitated. There was the singing out of other voices, the words forming and everything. But I think what you got to keep in mind is that for dramatic sake and for the sake of showing you what is possible in possession, you saw all of that in that one character. And I think that's important to keep in mind. You're not going to hear somebody sitting on a bed with their head spinning around. That did not happen. Did he vomit? Yes. Did words form on his body? Yes. Did he speak in other voices? Did he sing in other voices? Yes. Did he say horrible things? Yes. Did he do all of those things at the same time? They vary. They seem to grow up into the end, by the way.
So we get kind of a concentrated version in the film that has fundamentals of truth to exorcism cases in general. And that's a good thing to keep in mind. But I would like to emphasize that these cases are horrific. And people do go through pitched battles for spiritual survival, and they can take a toll on everyone present, as you so well document, in conflict with evil. Well, Stephen, our time is moving right along here tonight, and I wanted to touch on your own experiences that have some parallels to this case, the famous Union Screaming House, Union, Missouri, that you moved into and other people lived in, that seemed to have some very dark and demonic presences there that deeply affected people. Did you even, now this was what, 2001 when you moved into the Union House?
May 18th, 2001, I can tell you the exact date.
It's probably burned in your brain, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Did you have any idea that it was severely afflicted with some dark presence?
No. As a matter of fact, I had to do a walkthrough with the landlord. It was a rental, by the way. And I had to do a walkthrough before we moved in. And at one point, we were upstairs in the ice tray lets loose downstairs. It makes a loud banging noise. And the landlord about crawled out of their skin. And I looked at him and said, wait a second. I'm like, this is, you're not making me feel too good, about living here. I was joking, by the way. And that's when they looked at me and they said, do you believe in ghosts? And I said, no, I really don't. And it's not that a lot of times people say, were you skeptical? I'm like, it's not that I was really skeptical at that point in my life. I just didn't give it much thought. I really didn't. And so I was like, no. And they were like, well, good. We've never heard any stories. But obviously, it turned out that it was a very haunted house and things started happening right away. Now, in correlation, if I look at this case and that case, it attacked my children right away. And I got to tell you, this book was not a personal book. I wanted to write this book about this case because it wasn't going to, because The Uninvited was so personal, and it was about, it's always blessed are the wicked, very personal things. But at the time of writing Confrontation with Evil, there were times it became very personal because I would look at that boy and I would look at my kids and that what they went through, and I would the correlations were astounding in some ways. To the fact that I said this earlier, to see the mother not care what her child's going through. When I held my child in my arms as he was screaming and crying after finding him standing in the middle of the kitchen because something had chased him from the basement, and thinking to myself that this is normal and all kids go through this, and the justifications and the guilt that I felt later for those justifications. It's very shocking, and it's very telling, and it was very personal to go through this with that boy. You kind of feel like you went through it again. And what I saw the kids go through was horrible. And I think that's the key, Rosemary, is with these hauntings that affect these children and what it does to them and how it affects their lives. It's something that you'll never forget. All you have to do is hold a trembling child in your arms. And if there's anything that you can do, investigators that are listening out there, if there's a house that you can go to and you can help a child and you can help that child, whether it's paranormal or not paranormal, and I could give you cases where it wasn't paranormal that were pretty horrible, whatever you can do to make that child put his head on his pillow at night or her head on the pillow at night and be able to sleep, that is valuable. That is the most valuable thing you can be doing, because these things start in youth and they affect them for the rest of their lives. I see it with my children today.
Did anything come down to a demonic possession in that house?
If you read the full report from the church, it's about 156 pages. You wouldn't talk about a scary document. Read something like that about yourself. They think I was close to possession. I was under extreme oppression. The actual woman that lived there afterwards, they believe she was in full possession at that point.
And
we both came very.
Can you explain oppression for folks who might not know exactly what that is?
Well, I'll tell you what it was like to have it lifted. Because I went to the priest, and I knew I was going through these things. It felt like this black cloud was following me. I didn't know I was going through the blackouts, though. I heard about those later. The kids actually told me about them. I kept finding holes in the walls of my house, and I thought the kids were doing it. And I was actually getting on to them, like, you got to quit this. Come to find out, I was putting holes in walls in my sleep. But I go see the priest, and we tell him what's going on. And the priest looks at me, and he asked if he could pray over me. Now, interesting enough, he was what they call a mystic, and I didn't realize this at the moment. And I said, sure. And thinking, I was really nonplussed about the whole religious thing at that point. And you'd have to read the book, all of it, because we don't have time to discuss why. But there's a lot to it. But anyway, so he starts to pray, puts his hand on, he says, close your eyes. And he starts to pray. And as he starts to pray, I could feel this weight on my chest, like I couldn't breathe. And the more he prayed, the harder it got to breathe. And he continued. And at one point in the prayer, there were, and this is the only way I can describe it to you, there were 3 flashes of light, and they were audible. You could hear, they made a sound, a whooshing sound. And when those 3 flashes of light happened, I was able to breathe again normally. And I felt like something had lifted off me. I don't know how else to describe it to you. I became very different. I remember feeling like I never wanted to not feel that way again. Let me put it that way. And I go to my mom, by the way, afterwards. And I go and I said, this profound thing happened to me, and this is how I feel, and I don't understand. And now my sister had died. And my mom asked me, well, why do you think you had gotten to that point? And I said, because I think because I was turning my back on my religion at that point, where I had said to her that I was mad at God for taking her away. And that's when my mother looked at me and said, well, if there's a God, he didn't take her, he received her. There's a difference. But anyway, in that moment plays into it. But the actual lifting of the oppression was quite something. I can't put it to words.
Why do you think this piece of property was so horribly afflicted?
I do know during research, and the research that came out later where actually it came down to one of the family members. It was owned by an old Civil War captain named John T. Crowe, Crowe. You can look it up. The property actually was kind of pretty famous, and I didn't know, because he started the first Missouri militia in the Civil War. Actually, A.J. Say, S-A-E-Y, ended up selling the property to him, who was the first governor of Oklahoma, by the way. But he lived there with his wife, Minerva. Minerva, at one point, became pregnant with a baby that wasn't his. It was actually one of the slaves. And she carried it to term. And when she carried it to term, now this was interesting, Rosemary. There was always the indication, and I know a lot of people seen the a haunting thing, the entertainment version of the story, but people were actually seeing a baby hanging in the trees at points. I actually saw it at one point. And she actually had this baby, and he realized that it wasn't his. Now, this came from his ancestors, by the way. And when he realized that, he killed the baby, and he hung it in its christening gown by its feet from the tree to let the slaves know the servants at that point, because it was right after the Civil War, not to mess with him. And then he had the doctor It was, the doc he was a friend of his, and he handled all kinds of things. The doc wasn't a really good character, by the way. Anyway, he had him insert wires into her rib cage, where he punctured her lungs. Anybody who knows it would probably have looked like consumption. And she died. It took a little bit, but she died. She tried to get her to tell her which one of the servants that was the father of the child. She wouldn't, so he gathered up all the male servants and he shot them all. So there you go. That's enough to do it.
that certainly will pollute a property for a very, very long time. And I was fascinated to read literally the personal diary reports of many of the investigators who went to that place, and this had a hold on them, that they became almost obsessed or addicted to this place. And at what point do you pass the line from researching an investigation to becoming at risk yourself for assault and takeover?
I can tell you that it became such an obsession, but it was like a paranormal candy store, It would give you the most outrageous EVPs for the point. There were times I can remember just erasing EVPs because I knew I'd get 10 more in the next second. You know what I'm saying? And it was kind of like that, so it became this thing, this obsession to you. But things started to happen personally. I mean, we started seeing people with terrible marital problems, money problems. These people that were all really, really close, actually turning on each other within a very short period of time. And it was this place that did it to them. And I have never seen anything like it. I told you that before. Before I dealt with that, I had never really been in a situation where people didn't like me. I mean, it was very much an eye-opening experience in that sense. But it was very confusing at the same time because you didn't understand why. Why so-and-so would hate you, or why so-and-so was hating someone else. I mean, and everybody had these things going on at home, and they were taking these things home with them. They would wake up in the middle of the night and there would be dark figures in the rooms with them. And which, I think one of the first times you and I talked was about the dark figures. You were doing the shadow people thing.
That's right.
Yeah. And people were waking up in the rooms with these things, and these things were physically attacking them, so you had all of this going on, and it just tore us apart. Absolutely tore us apart. To this day, people don't talk to each other. And I think the valuable thing about it was, I realized that it was important from an investigator standpoint to tell the story. Because I think investigators that are out there putting themselves through these things need to realize how easy it is that if they hit upon the right thing, that it can absolutely tear them apart. So it was humbling because I had to admit so much of, where I made mistakes. And it was difficult, man. I don't know if I'd do it again. I hope to God I never have to do it again. Let's put it that way.
Well, this case led you onto the St. Louis case and, became part of your motivation to...
Well, what's interesting is 2 weeks before I had the oppression lifted from me in the Union case, and 2 weeks before Helen, who's Helen in the book, she passed away, by the way, but before her possession, and everything that happened there, we actually was when we went to the hospital where the priest was kept in 2005. So, I mean, that gives you an indication of how it led from one to the other. As a matter of fact, you get into the uninvited, there's actually a chapter where I talk about the, not as in greater detail as in Confrontation with Evil, but I talk about that exorcism floor in the priest a little bit, because we actually went through that at that same point. And then 2 weeks later, I think it was interesting that we actually went through the worst part of our ordeal. So there's connection there. whether I want to realize what it is or not, or whether I want to take accountability, which I did, by the way, for it. Does that make sense?
It does. And I want to emphasize that you've really walked the talk concerning various aspects of demonic cases, and that enables you to bring a very unique perspective to the St. Louis case as well. I have a question from Lorraine in the chat. Why do demons reveal themselves at all through humans? Why not stay hidden?
Well, that would be the question, doesn't it? I think there's a little bit of arrogance involved in that. It's hard to say. It's hard to say. There's always we do know there's always the purpose. There's always the target. In the St. Louis case, I think we started with the target as the mother, and it went to the priest eventually. But it's, in my case, I think it was me and it was Helen. Okay. But it always seems it's that person. And I think, if there is a God in this world, people, maybe that sometimes these things are allowed because there's lessons to be learned.
That's one of the things that the church has emphasized. They certainly said that in the Annalise Michel case. And we didn't mention, by the way, that she expired as a result of her ordeal. She was starved, dehydrated, pretty much out of her mind by the time.
Both her knees were broken from genuflecting, by the way.
I did read that, yes, and she was completely taken over. But the church's argument in her case was that sometimes the devil uses an innocent in order to sort of make the case that they can. You know
what, Rosemary? Look at it this way. I look at my ordeal and what I went through. Look at all the people that I've helped. I've helped a lot of people. I've sent people to help to other people. A lot of children. I mean, I can give you paranormal and non-paranormal instances. Maybe the purpose of what I went through, what my family went through, was so we could help other people along the way. The lesson was learned. There was a huge lesson learned. It's a lesson about positivity, a lesson about love, a lesson about family. I mean, that's obvious. But all of the people that help. So maybe there was a purpose, and maybe that's how I deal with it in life, is I realized there was a purpose and an ultimate ends to the mean. And that is the only way that I can reason it in my mind. And I hope that answers her question.
What advice do you have for people who either want to protect themselves from ever encountering anything demonic like this, or if they feel they're having a problem, what do they do?
Well, first of all, to protect yourself, it's a pretty simple prescription. We know that now in the day of digital media and stuff, we're all connected. It seems like we got our own network of survivors in that sense. And we all know that one of the things that indicates it is we were all at the lowest point of our lives. We were all very negative. Positivity, living a good life, love, family, humor. Those type of things are the things that keep you healthy and the things that keep you well and the things that will protect you from these things. Now, if you think you're going through something like that, then you reach out. And I suggest you reach out to multiple people. Don't just reach out to one. I could tell you I did. I mean, it took me forever before I found Johnny. I mean, thank God I found him, right? But it took a long time. And, so don't just go to one person. Keep going till you find the help you need. And I guarantee it's out there for you somewhere.
Why do you think the church is so resistant to provide help sometimes? I hear that so often that people are turned away by priests.
Yeah, there's so much fraud in this world, though. I mean, there's, how many times you've dealt with it, I've dealt with it. How many times have you come across the haunting because somebody thinks it's going to make them famous? It's a shame. Or how many times have you heard the person say, I want to see a demon. Let me get to a demon, So all of those things lead into the fact of that we have to be a little bit more cautious, and we have to go through the steps, which the steps are, physical ailment, medical ailment, psychological ailment, rule all that out. And then in the end, you might be dealing with spiritual. Most of the time, not.
Well, you've certainly seen a rise in negative and demonic cases in the TV shows because it makes for good entertainment and rivets the audiences. But do you think that demonic possession is increasing? Is it genuinely increasing?
Well, I think the more we pay attention to it, the more it is. I mean, we have Halloweens where we sit and watch exorcisms on television now. That can't be good. I mean, when you're looking and you're sitting and you're looking for evil and you're waiting for evil to happen at any given moment, and you got the family with the bowl of popcorn in front of you, there's a problem with that, Rosemary. There really is. And I think, we cannot make evil or the devil or demons superstars without having some kind of backlash from it. And I think we're seeing it. I really do. I think, Gerald Brittle said recently, in an interview I did years ago, that he thought that, 9/11 was the change, that we went from the age of evil to the age of the diabolic. I think we are in the age of the diabolic at this point. And I think part of it is entertainment feeds it.
It does. And we are at the end of our time tonight. Stephen, I want to thank you for being with us. Got to wrap the show. StephenLaChance.com, KGRARadio.com tonight. Stay tuned for Jimmy Church coming up with Fade to Black. See you on down that paranormal road.